Welcome to Recovering Evangelicals, a podcast for people who were once very comfortable in the Christian faith until the 21st century intruded and made it very hard to keep on believing. I'm your host, Luke Jansen.
And I'm Scott Dyer.
Last week's episode, number 219, was a landmark for this podcast. Listeners have often sent in comments or emails in response, often telling us what they thought about our claims or our content, or asking us to do an episode on this or that topic, and sometimes wanting to find out more about where we stand on a given point. One question that comes up often pertains to what do we think about Jesus himself and about the resurrection? And last week, I answered those two questions directly. I gave my personal confession, an inventory of many bedrock, foundational, core theological tenets of a traditional Christian faith, and I emphasize the word traditional there. The tenets that I've completely rejected, so things like hell, a personified or personal God, several atonement theories. And then another inventory of items or tenets that I've put on the shelf for now because I'm just not sure. I'm still open to them, but I'm not committed to them. So things like an afterlife, a creative life force, and others. And most importantly, and very specifically, who is Jesus now in my revised belief system, which I still call a Christian faith? And what do I believe about his resurrection? I'm not going to repeat any of that here if perhaps for some reason you've never heard it. I'm going to highly recommend you go back and listen to that episode before you continue listening to today's episode. Scott, more than once during that personal confession, I think I left you standing speechless or looking around for the exit door.
Oh, I don't know about the exit door, but yeah, there were some surprises, probably for the listeners as well.
Oh, there were, as we know from these comments. What we got was considerable. Although I do have to say that I didn't get any of the angry types of emails and comments that I would have expected from conservative or fundamentalist Christians who said I'd given up too much or that I had no basis for revising a traditional tenet in the way that I did, let alone any basis for even calling myself a Christian anymore. Instead, I did get comments and emails from Christians on the opposite end of the Christian spectrum, the more liberal side, and from people who had previously been fervent Christians but have since expunged all of that thinking from their lives. And interestingly, many of them also challenged me on whether I have a basis for still calling myself a Christian. What about you, Scott? Are you skeptical about my Christian status?
Well, I would never presume to judge somebody's Christian status.
You're not going to revoke my membership card.
Yeah. Once you start to define these things, they become kind of slippery. But I think it was good that you clarified what you mean by that and why you still consider yourself Christian in spite of dispensing with a lot of things that most people would think are essential to wear that label, you know.
A lot of which was added centuries, if not a millennia or two after Jesus and his teachings. But let me put a little bit of perspective on this wave of response that we got from our listeners. By definition, our listeners listen to podcasts, listen to our podcast. I don't for a moment expect that they listen only to ours. They'll listen to other podcasts as well, and some of them even listen to dozens of podcasts and YouTube videos and webinars. And the vast majority of them do not leave comments or questions at any of those media productions. Now, I'm not ranting here, I'm not criticizing, I'm just creating a reference point. Only a very small percentage of people leave comments or questions at these kinds of things. And by these kinds of things, I'm not talking about profile pages of one's Facebook friends or Instagram accounts of individual people that you know and they know you. I'm talking about pages from organizations, from speakers, from thinkers, talking to anonymous audiences, faceless crowds. People like Sam Harris and Jordan Peterson would be the biggest ones. Don't get me wrong, they get lots of comments and questions, but here's my point, only from a very small percentage of their total listening audience. Now think about it. I'm talking to the listeners now. Think about it. Do you leave comments and questions at big names like Harris or Peterson, or even lesser names with smaller audiences? Scott, how about yourself? Do you leave comments and questions at sites you visit, like Sabine Hossenfelder you've mentioned a few times?
Yeah. No, I very, very rarely.
Exactly.
Especially, like you mentioned, the big names. Maybe some of the lesser known people I might, but generally, no.
Yeah, that's my point. This is why any individual interaction from a listener or follower represents a much bigger audience. So for example, let's just say only 5% of people will leave a like. Then you multiply the number of likes you get by 20 to get a sense of the size of your audience.
Mm.
Maybe 1 in 1,000 people will leave a comment asking a question or stating opinion. Same thing. Again, if you dispute this, then count up how many websites you've checked out in your lifetime that had a space for comments, sites that were not just your family or immediate friends. So that's got to be more than 1,000 sites, I'm sure, that anyone might have visited in their lifetime. And then how many of those sites have you actually left a comment or question? Maybe one in 1,000. Maybe 1 in 100,000 people will actually write an email to those people. I mean, that's really stepping out there and engaging. Again, how many emails have you, the listener, or Scott, sent to speakers, writers, or thinkers that you've checked out at their websites? Well, we got several emails in response to this mini-series we did on the personhood of Jesus, especially the last episode of that series when I pulled back the curtain and tipped my hand, showed my cards. Many of those emails came from people that I've never heard of before. They weren't friends or family, not people from my past who were checking up on me. They were complete strangers, often new listeners, expressing their appreciation for what we were doing and asking questions about some of the details. That's engagement.
Yeah, it's great and encouraging.
Yeah, absolutely. Now, the response we got had me wondering about a number of questions that I had for them and for other members of our audience who didn't reach out to me. And one question that kept coming up over and over again from me was, did I go too far or not far enough? And I'll toss that one to you, Scott. Did I go too far or not far enough?
No, I don't think it went too far. It was just honest, and I think people appreciate that.
Now, I have to confess, I was looking for some critical feedback, not because I need my ego stroked, but I myself was trying to answer another question that people keep asking me, and I keep asking myself, which is, are we going to continue doing this podcast? Was episode number 219 our last for the season, or our last ever, our swan song? And Scott, you too keep asking me that question.
Yeah, I do. I guess part of the reason is because we've covered a lot of ground, and if we do continue, then should there be maybe some change in direction, some change in focus, and so on. So.
Okay, so I'm going to answer that question, whether we continue or not, in full at the end of this episode. But spoiler alert, it's a hesitant or qualified yes.
Mm-hmm.
And at that time, I'll also unpack how the nature or flavor of the podcast will change in response to a more clear understanding that I now have of the audience that we've affected, that we've attracted. But first, I want to share with the audience some specific bits of feedback we got from those listeners, the ones that actually took the time to write in. I reached out to 3 of the new listeners who wrote to us over the past few weeks, and also to a couple long-time listeners who have been with us right from the beginning, and asked them all the same short list of basic questions as follow-up to what we published in the previous episode. And the first question had to do with my 2 inventories, again, that list of bedrock foundational core theological tenets of traditional Christianity that I've now completely rejected, and another inventory of items or tenets that I've put on a shelf for now because I'm just not sure. I'm open to them, but I'm not committed to them. And then also my final conclusion about who Jesus is and his resurrection. And after putting all of that on the table, my question to these 5 listeners was, did I go too far or not far enough? Was I helpful or hurtful? Because I was a bit concerned that there might be listeners who could be offended or even hurt by my criticisms of some of those fundamental tenets of traditional Christian faith. So here's what they said to that question.
And first of all, you guys did the old thing about atheists taking their position as a matter of faith. And really, I'm going to push back. That is a straw man to end all straw men. Most atheists, including most that I have met, and I've met quite a few, will never say, I know there's no God. They're just not going to say that, because how could you know something that vast? What atheists say is, I haven't seen compelling evidence for a God who intervenes in our life, who loves us, who has any hand in day-to-day affairs, or however you want to word that. And that is not a faith statement. And by the time I was done listening to your episode, I thought, you are a Christian atheist because you have a realistic view of what God might be. You've taken God out of the small box that so many people stick God in and allow for many options. And that's where I am. I bet right now I could go through a list of questions about God and how we view God, and you and I would probably agree on almost every one. But you want to call yourself a Christian, and you even use the term Christian humanist. The notion of following moral teachings while not believing in a personal God isn't new, and you're there. I have no fear of God. I don't know if there is a God, but I do not live my life as though God has handed down moral teachings to somebody or some people, and God is not a part of my life and how I choose to make my ethical and moral decisions. But I don't go around saying there is no God. And most atheists don't. And you're on the dark side now. Welcome.
So I think I agree with everything you said. I had the same initial reaction as Scott did about the resurrected Jesus claim. I was surprised you thought that. Still, I'm left wondering, if you're willing to throw out so much, why keep what's left? What do you actually gain by holding on to Jesus and building a Christian humanism, as you call it, rather than treating him as one good, perhaps the best teacher? I have questions about that. But among many, and settling into a general humanism with harm reduction as your ethic, it seems like that middle position that you're taking leaves you in a camp that neither side really wants to claim.
I would say it's nuanced and it's hard to just give like a flat answer to that. My gut says you didn't go far enough. You still attach a sense of sacredness to either the Christian narrative or the scriptures, and possibly the tradition, I don't know. But for me, there's no reason to attach any such connotation to the scriptures or the Christian narrative. It becomes a piece of fiction. And so at the end of my journey, I just jettisoned all of it, saying it's just Bronze and Iron Age fiction. And so why are you struggling to hold on to any of it?
You were definitely helpful, definitely not hurtful, not for me. And you probably didn't go far enough based on my current mindset. I would not answer this question the same way 10 years ago. But I think where you seem to have landed as a Christian humanist, I would say that I am in not very different place. I'm at a very similar place, with the footnote that I am even more open-minded to go to other religions' sort of points of view. I remember you made the statement several times that you are sort of reserving your judgment about other religions mainly because they are not your cultural background. You are most familiar with Christianity. But I would suggest that that would be the next step, at least in my thinking, is to be even more liberal and start talking about God in a more general way, not just through the lens of Christianity.
For me, you didn't go too far. I mean, that's a very personal thing. And what I'm hearing is that you're working through what you are still able to believe. And who's it for me to say one way or another about that as I'm trying to work through this myself? I guess for some people, it could be hurtful if they're really locked into a very legalistic black and white view of Christianity and they don't know much about the historical facts and how the Bible came to be and all of that sort of stuff that I think is very lacking in the traditional evangelical view of Christianity.
Yeah, that was very interesting feedback. And I got to say, I tend to agree. When you and I talked, and when we've talked many times apart from the podcast, I've had the same kind of thoughts of why do you want to hang on to certain things? And it seems very important for you to consider yourself, in some sense, a Christian. Why? Why is that? Why does that matter? Which I think is very interesting. So, yeah, I get where people are coming from here, and I had the same kind of questions.
I know I've heard this more than once. He asked me, after I've rejected so much of Christianity, why do I still hold on to these ideas that I think makes me Christian? And my brother asks me that repeatedly. He keeps using the word, an emotionally charged word, the word clinging. Why are you still clinging to this idea? And so I want to first dispense with that word. Clinging is, again, an emotionally charged word. You cling to a lifebuoy when you're drowning, right? One clings to a cigarette when they're trying to quit. You cling to a rock when you're slipping off a cliff. Or you cling to a memory of a loved one who's now gone. Cling has an emotion built into itself, often an air of desperation. And trust me, this is the point I want to make. For me, there's no desperation. There's no emotional attachment to the label. I don't do it to avoid hell. I don't do it to get into heaven, specifically because I don't hold the traditional beliefs in those two states or places, heaven and hell. And I don't do it because I've met Jesus and I love him so much, so I'm not clinging. But yes, I think the label Christian is still apt for me. I hold ideas and values that I attribute to Christ. I'm Christian. And as I said in the previous episode, I do that because I'm familiar with the teachings of many people, to varying degrees in each case, but I'm most familiar with Christ's worldview, and I find that worldview attractive, most attractive. I like most of the things I've heard about Gandhi, but I really don't know where he stands on many issues, and I can't quote a single one of his sayings. I can quote one that's often attributed to him incorrectly. Some people say he's the one that said, "Your Jesus I like, but it's the followers I can't put up with." It turns out I did some checking on this. It's not, apparently Gandhi did not say that. It was another Indian philosopher named Bharadada.
Oh, interesting. It's funny how these things get attributed, to different people. So often you find out that, well, they actually never really said that.
Yeah, exactly. But back to the original point, that's why I still hold the label Christian. I hold Christian views. I have a Christian worldview.
So then you're not in any sense of what most people would call Christian. Like you're not a traditional Christian
No, absolutely not.
or historic Christian. So would you be a kind of a moral Christian? Is that more or less where you've landed?
Well, that sounds apt. I mean, I might have to spend more time thinking about it, but yes, yeah. I'm absolutely not a traditional Christian. A lot of things that are in traditional Christianity I can't hold anymore, but certainly the moral aspects of it, absolutely.
Yeah. Okay. Another term that gets floated around these days quite often is cultural Christian.
Cultural. I thought you'd say that.
Yeah.
Well, and that, if you think about it, that's wrapped up in what I said. I'm most familiar with the teachings of Christ because I grew up in it. That's my culture. And I can,
right.
as I said last week, I can quote pretty well any saying that Jesus said. And I've heard 10 different ways to interpret anything that he said. So yeah, I'm a cultural Christian, and as you call it, a moral Christian. Yeah.
Yeah, okay.
Now, I want to say a few things about what one of the, actually, I think it was the first listener that we heard from say there. He got quite animated about what I said about atheism being a faith statement.
Right.
And in your defense, Scott, you called me on that too in that episode. You said, okay, people aren't going to like that, right?
Right. It's a common accusation that especially Christian apologists will make. They'll say, well, you accuse us of having faith, but, as far as we're concerned, you have just as, or I've even heard many times they'll say, it takes more faith to not believe in God than it does to believe in God. So, yeah, it's a barb, and I can see why people might react to that.
Right. And I did apologize to anyone who might get offended. And apparently my first listener there that we heard from got quite indignant. We know him. He knows us. We've talked about this many times. We've got a lot of love between us, but that's one thing he doesn't like. And I apologize again. But that was not my intent. Let me just explain why I made that statement. I think the biggest problem is that atheism can mean two subtly different things. If you look up the official definition of atheism, you'll find that it means the specific disbelief or lack of belief in the existence of deities. And those are two very different things. Specific disbelief and lack of belief are two different things. And our listener is tapping into the second of those two definitions, the lack of belief in the existence of deities. He was emphatic that most atheists will not say there is no God. I'm trying to echo the way he put it.
Yeah.
And more than once he said, I have no evidence of there being a God. And he was correct in saying that I, myself, am in that same camp. I, too, said several things about God in which I said, I'd like to believe it's all true, but I'm just not seeing it. I'm open to it, but I'm unsure. I'm not committed, which makes me agnostic. And I want to come back to that word in a minute. But I use the word atheism in the first sense of that definition, the specific disbelief. That letter A in front of a word is a prefix that comes from the Greek, and it gives the word the completely opposite meaning. Think about the words like typical and atypical, complete opposites. Apolitical, someone who's apolitical is just not political. Asymmetrical, asexual, amoral, complete opposites to their root words. And it can get very nuanced. There are subtle differences between saying amoral and immoral. Subtle differences between asexual and non-sexual. Subtle differences between a-religious and irreligious and non-religious. And so for me, atheism means a specific disbelief in the existence of deities. Being atheist is someone who goes around saying there is no God, definitively. And whenever I'm talking to someone who says there is no God, definitively, I'll ask them, what do you base that on? What's your argument? What's your evidence? And they fail to give me anything convincing. And that's what I mean by the position being held as a faith statement. It's a view that is held without evidence. It's a belief. But if instead that person says, hey, look, I don't know, I just don't have any evidence that God exists, which is what that listener said, I call that agnosticism. Gnostic comes from the Greek word for knowledge or knowing, gnosis. So agnostic means not knowing. I don't know. And if you ask Google what's the difference between atheism and agnosticism, you'll get this answer. Atheism and agnosticism address two different concepts, belief versus knowledge. And then Google goes on to say that an atheist does not hold a belief in any god or gods, while an agnostic views the ultimate truth about a higher power as unknown or impossible to know. And so I am an agnostic, not an atheist. I don't have any evidence for there being a personal God who interacts with humans in a personal way. I'd like it to be true, I'm open to it, but I can no longer say I know it to be true. I'm not knowing. Agnostic, the opposite of Gnostic. But I'm not going to absolutely declare there is no God, which is an atheistic statement. Nor am I going to say that the concept of God is irrelevant, unimportant, which is a non-theistic statement, a position held by certain Buddhists and many scientists. But non-theistic is different from atheistic and different from agnostic.
Yeah, that's some important clarifications. One of the problems, I should say, I think, is that we often view these things as binaries, on or off. You're either, a quote believer, you're kind of all in, or you're an atheist, you're all out, on or off. And the reality is that, like so many things, I think that when we talk about a lot of things these days, we recognize that there's really a spectrum. And people are at different places in that spectrum, or if you want to liken it to a journey. There are those, there's the ardent believer who's in some cases actually fanatic, that is just so certain that they're correct and everybody else is wrong and so on. From that to the other end of that spectrum, which is, and can be just as fanatical, adamant that there absolutely is nothing, who are ardent materialists, the material universe is all there is. And they're just as certain and adamant about that. But the reality is that almost everybody is neither one of those. They're somewhere in between.
Right.
And I think that agnosticism probably captures where people are at a lot, in many cases, more accurately than atheist.
Right. And I like what you said, Scott. I think I'm going to build on that. This is not a rebuttal, but a building on it. It is a spectrum, but it's actually a two-dimensional spectrum. I mean, usually the spectrum, you go from one side to the other, left or right, and that's one dimension, but there's also a depth to this. Because again, the Google definition, it says that atheism and agnosticism are getting at two different things, belief versus knowledge. And then you can be fully believing or fully not believing, and fully knowing what you don't believe or fully knowing what you do believe. Those are two dimensions. So it gets pretty complex.
Oh, yeah, For sure. It's not a coincidence or whatever that for thousands of years we've been musing on these things and written hundreds of thousands of books on the subject. These are deep, they're deep issues.
Right. Complex indeed. So here's something that might throw some people in a spin. And Scott, I'm going to start with a question to you. In your belief system, if it was definitively shown in some way or another, it was absolutely definitively proven that there is no God or Jesus, how would that affect your Christian faith?
Oh, well, I guess it would wipe it out.
Would it?
I think so. Well, yeah, it might not wipe out many aspects of it in the sense of, like you said before, like some of the morality and things like that. But yeah, if that could be definitively shown, I don't think it can.
No.
Then yeah, I think that would be pretty devastating.
Well, that was one of the things that one of our listeners asked. He asked me, and I said, basically, so first of all, he asked the question, if it is some way it could be shown definitively, and you're right. I don't know how you ever would definitively prove that. You'd have to have a greater than God amount of knowledge to know whether there is a God. It's just kind of... And he asked if I came to that realization, would that affect my Christianity? And I thought about it. I said, no, I don't think it would change anything for me. And not because I would stubbornly continue with a self-delusion, telling myself that everybody's wrong about God and Jesus not existing, it wouldn't be that kind of a thing. Instead, for me, Christ can be the avatar for a set of beliefs and ethics one calls Christian. He embodies those beliefs and those teachings. We can refer to someone as a MacGyver, who was a fictional TV character that people my age will recognize, and any listeners under 30 or 40, they're not going to know who I'm talking about, but they might refer to someone else as Arthurian, after the fictional King Arthur. They might talk about somebody working through a problem like a true Sherlock Holmes, or try to emulate everything about James Bond, everything. Both of those are completely fictional characters. If it were ever proven that Socrates was a fictional character, would all philosophers give up Socratic thinking or Socratic methods?
No.
Long pause, because that's a Socratic question.
Yeah.
So in the same way, if it turns out that I become convinced for some reason that there is no God or no Jesus, I can still hold out those teachings as an ideal to strive towards and to see as a salvation message for humanity climbing the evolutionary ladder. I can still do that. But if I think that Jesus is more, that he's more than an avatar, then I can even build on that. But a lot of words to say no. I would still say I hold a Christian worldview, even though it might be shown that there never was a Christ.
Yeah, I can see that. And even for myself, I may very well end up in a similar place, even if it was definitively shown that this was all bunkus. But I guess for me, I would not call that Christian, I guess.
I hear what you're saying, Scott. I still think it's Christian, it's Christian. The set of beliefs are Christian. And I want to emphasize again to the listeners that I'm not saying I only see he's an avatar for those beliefs. No, I think he was a real person, and I think he could potentially be a lot more than human. So as I said last week, I'm open to the idea of him being an elevated human, a chosen person. That depends on to the extent that I can be convinced that there's a God who intervenes in human affairs. And that's, I said last week, that's one where I'm finding it hard to see that, but I want to believe it's true.
I guess the other issue I think maybe that should be mentioned is that one of the differences between Jesus and so many other thinkers and so on is that so much in Christianity, so much is attached to his person and the claims that he made. So Socrates doesn't really, in fact, many people don't believe Socrates existed. He may have just been an invention of Plato for him to express his ideas. That's a minority opinion, but it doesn't matter much because what we care about Socrates is not the person of Socrates, but the things that he taught, his thought.
Exactly.
Right?
Right.
And so what, in your case, I think what you're doing is you're reducing Jesus down to that same level, that you're seeing him as one of the key moral teachers. Even if it turned out he didn't exist, that you could still hold to that. You could still believe that, we should love our neighbor, we should love our enemy, those kind of things.
Exactly.
Right? Yeah. So, but for those who are traditional Christians or historical, whatever you want to call it, who attach their belief to his person, the things that he claimed about himself and so on, that wouldn't be very satisfying.
I get that 100%. And
Yeah.
that's why I said I'm not a traditional Christian.
Yeah, no, for
I've
sure.
rejected a lot of that.
Yeah.
So, okay. I also heard our listeners challenge my claim that Jesus was one of the greatest teachers in history. In particular, he, the one who mentioned this in particular, pointed out that Jesus never spoke out against slavery. This is one of the reasons why he now is very critical of Jesus. And we've talked to him before about this and other reasons, and it came up in my conversations with him again here, and I thought about it for a while, and here's what I want to say. I'm convinced that when Jesus was busy traveling through first century Palestine and teaching, he was a product of his own culture. Our whole mini-series on this question underlines my conviction that he was indeed fully human. In fact, fully Jewish. Fully first century Jewish. I don't think he would have been able to fix my transmission problem of my car or debug my computer. I don't think I would get very far with talking to him about the origin of life, the biochemistry and the physics, beyond him saying Yahweh did it. I could go on. He did only and could only talk about things from the point of view of a first century Jew. And to get to the point here, that whole concept of equal rights for all people just wasn't anywhere in the world at that time. It wasn't at all in their zeitgeist. Their world was all about different levels of human existence, and some people were just given a higher level of rights and privileges, and that just wasn't questioned. They were born into it. One could wonder what it would be like to enjoy that privilege, just like today we might wonder what it's like to be able to fly. But we in the 21st century don't debate about all people being given equal rights to be able to fly. It's not in our zeitgeist. The Greeks and Romans in the first century were just privileged above other nationalities just because. They might have been starting to toy with the idea of working or buying one's way into a higher privilege. And so in the book of Acts, for example, chapter 22, we read about Paul, who looked like any common Jew of that era, and he was protesting to a Roman commander about being whipped despite being a Roman citizen. And that commander kind of muttered under his breath how he had to pay a lot of money for his citizenship. And Paul says, yeah, but I was born a citizen. It meant a lot more. And Paul had rights. And to get back to the point we're talking about here, for Jesus to teach about freeing all the slaves, there just was no concept of that in that world at that time. That claim or demand just wouldn't get any resonance at all. Nowhere, anywhere in the world. Even the slaves themselves will be caught off balance by that kind of talk. It was just woven into their zeitgeist that they were slaves, born slaves. That was their position in life. Jesus also didn't speak against elective abortion. That also just wasn't in debate back then for several reasons. He didn't speak against cultural appropriation, something that many people argue about in today's society, whether it's offensive to dress up like someone from another culture, but no one even questioned cultural appropriation in the 19th century, let alone in the first century Roman Empire. Jesus didn't say anything about using pronouns or making assumptions about someone's gender or sexuality. All three of those things, pronouns, gender, and sexuality, were fully within the lexicon, the linguistic toolkit back then, but absolutely no one anywhere in the world was debating those things. No one demanded them. No one would have even understood what the fuss was about if they heard our conversations on the subjects. And so the same thing in my mind applies to slavery. As hard as it might be for us today to understand that, it just wasn't something they thought about.
Yeah, I think that's an important point. The other thing that's important to recognize too is that at least from everything we see in the Gospels and other writings, Jesus seemed to be focused on a very particular mission, a very particular idea. I mean, I think one of the things that there's pretty good consensus on among scholars, no matter how skeptical they tend to be about the historical Jesus, is that he was some sort of apocalyptic figure, that he thought that something was changing in the world in a very major way, that the old world was coming to an end and a new world was emerging. And a lot of his teachings, if you read the Sermon on the Mount, for example, that's all through it, right? That this is a manifesto for a new world, for a new kingdom.
Right. Yeah.
It wouldn't even make sense in the world that people lived in.
Right.
So those other issues, they weren't his concern. If you asked him about them at the time, he probably would have had an opinion, but that just wasn't his focus. And yet, as his teachings unfolded, they did become a concern, right? Paul deals with slavery. And then later Christians, of course, take up that issue in a quite a serious way.
Right. So what you're saying there, Scott, reminds me when I was talking with our listener at the time, he mentioned that, and I said I wanted to use an analogy. I referred to Darwin. I'm getting at now what you just said about how Christ began saying a few things, but didn't speak on the fullness of the subject, but then Paul picked it up, and then later Christians really took the ball and ran with it. So that's what I'm dealing with here, using Darwin as an analogy. Many people today, especially scientists, will label Darwin as one of the greatest scientists ever, or at least to have come up with one of the greatest scientific ideas. And yet, he didn't get the whole story about the origin of species out there. He didn't fully explain how organisms inherit the characteristics that make them so competitive, so much more fit for survival, because the fact is, he didn't know anything about genes or genetic mechanisms. Nobody did. That came decades. It took decades to get there. And that new information filled so many gaps that Darwin left wide open. We even had to come up with a whole new term for Darwin's ideas. We call it neo-Darwinism, or the modern evolutionary synthesis. That doesn't mean that Darwin didn't make one of the greatest contributions to science ever. And you can make the exact same argument for Isaac Newton and how quantum physics didn't dismiss his ideas, but complemented them. And likewise for Einstein and his physics.
Yeah, knowledge builds on itself, right?
Yeah.
Newton's famous statement, about being like a boy on the seashore, and if he's seen further than other people, it's only by standing on the shoulders of giants, right?
Yeah, exactly.
And so, yeah, when you start to unravel the implications of the things that Jesus did teach, the fact that, we should love our enemies, that we should be self-sacrificing, that we should care about the other, and so on. When the implications of those things start to unfold, then it has radical implications for things like slavery and how we treat the poor and so on and so forth. But Jesus himself didn't go into those consequences. Right.
And that's exactly, we did those episodes on the moral arc increasing, and that there was an inflection point around the time of Christ and then the church coming out there, that he began a movement that completely changed the trajectory of humanity.
Yeah.
So that's all the rebuttals that I've got from our listener feedback, but I want to now go into a very different direction. This whole exercise, the 8 weeks talking to our guest experts on several points that were important for me coming up with a new Christology, a new theology, in fact, and then the feedback I got from the listeners on that new theology, those two things both brought me to a point where I see the podcast now needing to become something a bit different. I see a new target audience and a new vision and a new modus operandus. But more on that in about 15 minutes. First, I want to unpack the other questions that I asked our listeners. Again, these are a unique subset of our listeners. They're not the silent majority. They're the vocal minority, or I don't know what to say, the scribal minority. They're the ones that wrote comments. They took the time to write in. Not the ones to quickly hit likes or hearts or to leave a brief, poorly thought out comment at a social media site. I see these all the time. I hear them referred to as troll comments or brain dumps, hot takes, and gotchas. All too often, those kind of comments are hidden behind a cryptic pseudonym. Intergalactic Warrior 87 or Rogue Maverick 69. Instead, this subset of listeners sent emails with their full real-world names attached, and they wrote paragraphs of carefully thought-out points and excellent questions. And remember what I said previously about how those small numbers reflect a much larger but silent majority. Scott and I view those as the gold nuggets in a stream bed full of millions of pebbles. They are the true red herring, and I know that's a bit of a twist on that saying, but it's still entirely appropriate for what I'm talking about here. So let's get to know these 5 people that we spoke to who represent the kind of audience we want to talk to. First, here's what they said when I asked them to summarize where they began walking their faith and where they're at now.
It's been probably 30 plus years since I started my deconstruction. And there was a whole episode where they talked to me about this, and you can go back and listen to that.
Episode number 124.
But I left fundamentalist Christianity for 2 main reasons. I studied the Bible, I read the Old Testament, and as I read the laws in the Old Testament, and I read them all, it just kept coming back to me like, the God of the universe didn't say this. That's nuts. And I believed he did up until that point. And as I just explored what the laws of the Old Testament were, allegedly handed down by God, I said, I don't believe that anymore. I also stopped believing that God, if there is a God, is going to torture people for all eternity. That made zero sense. Zero. It's a boogeyman that's been used throughout history, but I just don't believe it. I'm not afraid of it. I don't think it's real. And I think it's an insult to God to think that God would do that. But it's possible. In an infinite universe, it is possible. So we went to increasingly liberal churches, did not find satisfactory answers, stopped going for the longest time. I'm in the Air Force. I spent a year in Afghanistan, where my lack of faith was severely tested when we were sure that we were going to be attacked the following day and a lot of us would die. It didn't come to pass. But I found that I did not need to pray to God, ask God to help me. Didn't happen. It wasn't a part of my life anymore. When I got back, I discovered the Unitarian Universalist Church here locally. They welcomed me as an atheist. I liked it so much that once I retired from the Air Force, went to seminary on the GI Bill and was the lay minister and then minister at that church for almost 10 years. As far as deconstruction, I haven't called myself a Christian for a long, long time. I don't miss it. And it's been a wonderful, freeing experience for me to have left the fundamentalist Christianity and even keeping in touch with liberal Christians as I have throughout these years. I just don't call myself a Christian. I have no desire to call myself a Christian.
So I came from an evangelical Christian background. My parents were missionaries, and then he eventually became a pastor. He's still a pastor today. So that's kind of where it started. And then I went to college out in Massachusetts at Gordon College, which is a Christian liberal arts college, where I met my wife and had my kids and stayed out here. And then in about 2015, I started to doubt my religion. So that just kind of opened my eyes to that maybe the Bible wasn't purely true. I always had these convictions that, these things don't make sense. There's a lot of contradictions in this book. And this kind of opened my eyes and gave me permission to explore this. And the more I've explored it, the more I'm not against the Bible and its truth, but I do find it hard to hold on to its beliefs and align with a lot of what has been said in the show about different things. Basically, right now, I would consider myself an agnostic. I know it's easy and a lot of people will say it, but I'm not against there being a God. I just don't see the evidence for a personal God anyways.
Okay, yeah, I was what many people would call fundamentalist, part of what's called the Restoration movement in America. So the bottom line on that is we believe that the scriptures were from God, that the spirit of the message was directly from God, even if it contained little errors, but that was authoritative and really the bottom line for everything else in our lives. And then where I ended up at the end of decades of thinking about it is I jettisoned all of it. I don't believe in any of the monotheistic religions, but I did remain a type of theist, one which is very different from the monotheisms. It bears no resemblance to the idea of special revelation. If I had to throw it into one category, which would be sloppy, but if I had to, I'm some type of a deist, panpsychist deist. I don't know. I mean, it becomes very difficult at that point to pinpoint it.
So I began at a very fundamentalist, literalist understanding and interpretation of the scripture in a Plymouth Brethren group over in Central Europe. I still think highly of my friends from those communities, but I moved away in a sense from this literal understanding of the Bible, or even from the concept that the Christian Bible is the Word of God. I'm becoming convinced that this is actually at the root of the current problem, and we need to reframe the entire concept of God and faith and religion in a much more non-religious way. I think you are working on that, and there is still a lot more that needs to be done. I now landed at, I like the term Christian humanism. The word Christian is there mainly because of my cultural background, because of my upbringing. But humanism is really the center, is the life of kindness, non-violence, following the Sermon on the Mount ideas. So that's where I am right now.
I grew up in a very conservative, sort of Baptist run community. When I got into adolescence, I kind of rebelled by becoming born again and trying to save everybody around me, that kind of thing. I became very legalistic. I went to college and actually went to a youth group at a Lutheran church. And the pastor there was just the most amazing guy. He really worked on all of us learning to accept each other as we are. And I don't know that I had ever really heard that grace before. So that turned me around in a lot of ways. And then you fast forward in the political environment we're in with the kind of commandeering of Christianity by political folks and the Christian nationalist way of looking at things. So then I started listening to podcasts like yours and learning a lot more, just trying to understand exactly how the Bible came to be and the kind of ridiculousness of this idea that it was dictated through Moses or whatever it is.
And where would you say you're at now?
Oh, gosh. I'm in a crisis of faith at the moment. I still believe wholeheartedly in the teachings of Jesus and in his teaching of how we should treat each other. Honestly, I'm not sure what else I believe.
So that's what the 5 that wrote in, that's what they had to say about their own journey. And I think there's some really common things that I want to pull out. I want to point out to the rest of our audience. All 5 of these said they started out as evangelicals, even fundamentalists. All 5 of them went to college or university. Most of them went to a Christian institution, even taking some religious training, and at least a couple pursuing a degree in religious studies of some kind. And yet they went down that slippery slope. They described making their way through several different types of Christianity, different denominations, and all 5 of them placed themselves near the bottom of the slippery slope, having rejected most or all of the tenets of a traditional Christianity. And then most of them saying they still have some kind of a religious or spiritual streak in them. One even went to seminary when he finally settled on being an atheist in order to become pastor of the church. One said he's a deistic panpsychist, another said Christian humanist. They're all still, as we say, scratching the itch.
Yeah, it's a good way to put it. And I think when you're talking about people in these cases, and in your case, and to some degree in my case, although it's a bit different, when you're raised in a particular faith and you experience it in your formative years, that's incredibly powerful.
Exactly.
I mean, we know now scientifically that these neuronal synaptic connections in our brains, have so much to do with how we think and feel and our behaviors. Cognitive behavioral therapy is probably the most successful therapy out there these days, and it's based on the fact that you can learn to think differently, and when you learn to think differently, it actually changes your brain chemistry. And
Right.
So given that, it's not surprising really that as people's thoughts change, as their ideas change, there's still a whole other bunch of baggage that goes with those things that won't change as quickly, right? They will have to be worked through, and that takes a lot of time.
Right. It takes time, and it takes some, sometimes it takes help from sociologists and psychologists as well. We did 2 or 3 episodes on religious trauma. Episodes 46 and 47, and also 108. And what comes out of a Christian upbringing.
Right.
I was listening to a podcast, and I wish I could recall the details, but they were going on about how a lot of people think that Christianity is good for people. It gives them purpose, it gives them values and whatever, and it's all good for them. Like a drug might be good. And so they said, imagine there was a drug being marketed that had like a 30% rate at which people who took this, they developed major psychological issues from taking this drug. How long would that drug survive on the market? How long? It just would be yanked. Yeah. And that's the point with this Christianity. You look at how many people come through Christianity and develops all this religious trauma.
Yeah, and it's religion is an incredibly powerful force, and when you really think about it, you look at what's going on in our world,
right.
And at the very heart of it is religion in some sense, right? Whether it's what we traditionally call religion or whether it's just secularism also can be a quote, religion in a sense. You know, it has adherents that follow it and that believe that it's right and want to change society accordingly. Well, that's pretty much religion.
Right. And I want to emphasize what we're saying about Christianity, the way we're criticizing it. I'm criticizing what it became, what other people made of it. They turned it. And I'm going to come back to that in a few minutes.
Yeah.
But maybe at this time I ask another question of our listeners, what kind of persistent fears or concerns they had going down that slippery slope. And I had some premonitions of what they would say, but I want to first let you hear how they put it, how they answer the question.
The biggest problem with deconversion was, first of all, wondering how my wife would react, because she was a woman of faith and thought her husband was a good Christian. And now that I was having doubts, there was a deep concern about that. And we finally sat down and talked about it. And much to my delight, she found herself with the same questions and was willing to go on this journey with me. When that turned out to not be a problem, it was also a problem with our parents, who both sets were fundamentalist Christians. All of our friends from years and years were Christians. And they, for the most part, weren't real thrilled that we had left the faith. So it was not an easy journey. There was a cost for me, but I had to be honest with myself.
Definitely. Hell was huge. I was terrified of hell, I think, until last year, I think, is when I finally felt like, you know what, I don't think there's an eternal hellfire, that was the biggest thing. And then the other thing was just everybody I knew was still, and my wife included, like, we're still going to church, still bringing our kids to church. My brother, my cousin, all my friends and my parents were all just hardcore evangelical Christians. And it just made it really, I just felt like I was on an island. And when I told my wife, it was like this big moment, where do we go from here? Like that type of moment. So those two were the things that were just really difficult.
Yeah, it was that I wasn't gonna get to live forever in joy and paradise and some transcendent life. So, I mean, that was always nagging at me.
The main fear is the reaction of my old friends. I've experienced this to some extent, but if I was as open with them as I am with you right now, they would probably write me off even more. So that's the main difficulty, main struggle. I don't want to go through the trauma of broken relationships. I've seen other people suffering like that. So I would say that's my main fear. It's much bigger than my fear of losing my salvation or something like that. Hell was an issue in the past, but it no longer is.
There was a fear of hell. That was true earlier in my doubting, because there was that hardwired in to be afraid of hell and God's judgment. But, and I do have judgment of friends who I'm pretty sure say I'm not a real Christian anymore, that kind of thing.
Yeah, really almost heartbreaking to listen to some of those comments. But what it demonstrates is so true, that this kind of journey is not an intellectual journey, or not only an intellectual journey. It's partly that, but changing your ideas about some of these things, especially for people who are raised in a certain way, it's cosmic, to use a hippie term. It's quite earth-shattering. It can mean, like people said, friends, family, your whole social network. And I do think that many people remain in the institutions for that reason, because it's just easier to stay there. That's where the social circles are and so on. And just kind of, keep quiet. Don't question, don't be a rabble rousers and raise people's suspicions, but just enjoy the social aspects of faith, even if they don't really deep down believe much of it, or even maybe any of it anymore. I think there's thousands of people attending churches in that situation, and that's unfortunate. And there's a certain dishonesty there, but it's very, very understandable.
Right. And that's what struck me too. I said I had some premonitions, and I totally expected the first thing that they all would say would be the fear of hell. And maybe that's because that was one of my fears when I was deconstructing. Two of them did say this was a major concern, but two others indicated, okay, it was there, but not necessarily the most important. But what really surprised me as well, as you just said, it surprised me and yet it shouldn't have, is how they feared the adverse response they would get from their immediate loved ones in their community. And it's those two observations that they're the two biggest concerns, the only two that were mentioned, in fact. I think those are the most diabolical aspects of certain forms of Christianity. In many ways, Christianity is a meme, an idea that can infect the human brain and be transmitted from one human to another like a virus. I know that's a very provocative analogy. Some might find it offensive, but please indulge me, because I think the analogy is instructive. Okay, let's just try to work with what we can learn from this. Some versions of that mind virus are toxic, and I now include much of evangelical and fundamentalist Christianity in that category. And one of the ingredients in those versions of the mind virus that makes them so potent, so infective, and so persistent is to build into it some coding that convinces you that if you disinfect yourself, if you rid yourself of this virus, you will be rejected by the community and you will suffer horribly for the rest of your existence. Those are powerfully potent and toxic ingredients. They're ingeniously coercive tools for creatures that are highly social beings. Creatures that were hardwired through billions of years of evolution to be part of a community with an instinct for self-preservation and pain avoidance. And when I realized the extent to which I myself participated in propagating that viral, toxic part of Christianity, I referred in the past to participating in dramatic plays like Heaven's Gates and Hell's Flames, promoting these ideas of hell and blacklisting in our Bible studies and in our Sunday school and youth group lessons, in our conversations and in raising our kids, telling our kids, our youth group, our peers, whom you should now need to avoid. Don't talk to them. Don't read their books. I now loathe all of that. But so there's aspects of Christianity that employ those strategies, and I call them viral and toxic. But it needs to be said that there are other strands of Christianity that don't use those threats.
Yeah, it's an issue that's endemic to pretty much all religion, isn't it? In many, or at least to some degree. You know, the Catholic Church has its way of keeping people in its walls. The Scientologists have their ways of doing it. They label them and shun them and even harass them. The Mennonite community, the certain sects, I'm not talking about maybe the mainstream, but they have the whole idea of shunning. Well, actually, I think it's the Amish who have the idea of shunning. When somebody leaves the community or whatever, you shun them, you know, and they'll say, you know, oh, it's done in love. You know, this is, we're loving them. We're trying to get, you know, we're shunning them so they'll come back, but I don't buy it.
Right.
And this makes sense because there's always a power element to any religious group, and that power element is just that. It wants to exert power over the followers, and you see that in the New Testament playing out. Yeah.
Now, I want to get back to this analogy of the virus. That's one of the ingredients in this virus, that whole thing about, you know, community, and if you get rid of this virus, you're going to be shunned by the community, which is, again, that's a powerful threat for beings that are extremely social. We humans are incredibly social beings. And so that's one of the ingredients that is encoded within this virus. And there are other ones. Again, hell is the other one. If you get rid of this virus, then you're going to go to an eternal conscious torment. It's an ingredient that I've put long behind me, and I wish we could just get rid of entirely. We've done 3 episodes on that subject of hell, and I encourage the listeners to go to episodes number 11, number 88, and number 146, and I've written a whole book on that. That was the subject. It was part of my master's degree in theological studies, and the topic is, the title is Soul Searching, the Evolution of Judeo-Christian Thinking on the Soul and the Afterlife. I think it's important for people to understand that this is an idea that developed over time, and it's humans driving it the whole way. So check it out at our website or wherever you buy great books. But there's another potent ingredient in this virus. That's what viruses are. They're little packages of proteins and ingredients that are coding, and this is another one. In addition to that eternal conscious torment and excommunication from the tribe, there's coding that convinces you that the Bible is the very word of God, unadulterated by human flaws or human ideas. And I see that coding as the outer coat protein of the virus. It's part of the outer structure that convinces the cell to absorb the entire viral package, right? We heard some of our listeners say that, how developing immunity to that idea was one of the first steps in getting rid of the virus. One of the first steps down that slippery slope was realizing the Bible is, there's a little bit of humanity in this document. And that was certainly part of my journey, and I think yours too, Scott.
Yeah, for Protestants in particular, the Bible is the new center of authority. During the Reformation, that's what the big break was. You know, the church had been the final arbiter of all things to do with the faith, and Luther comes along and says, no, the Bible should be that final arbiter. And that was a welcome change at that time and break from certain traditions that were really oppressive. But then it became just another form.
Yeah.
You know, in a sense, this is way oversimplifying things, but in a certain sense, Protestants created a new pope, a paper pope, you know.
Right. Yep.
And they thought that the feeling was, well, that'll solve the problem with authority. We have the Bible, but that it doesn't solve the problem.
Right. Okay, before we move on, though, I just want to make it absolutely clear. I've been talking quite harshly about Christianity and comparing it to a virus, and I want to be very clear. This is not true of all Christianity. I said earlier, I myself want to claim the label Christian. I'm open to the idea of there being a God of some kind and to the idea that God would want to show our species a better way, that metaphorical evolutionary ladder. And as I always want to add to that, becoming more complex, not just biologically and cognitively, but also morally, ethically, and religiously. And the idea of Jesus being the template for that climb up the ladder. I'm open to all those ideas. To me, that's true Christianity, true good news, true gospel. But some humans have taken that good news, that gospel, and contaminated it with potent and toxic ideas like hell, eternal conscious torment, penal substitutionary atonement, othering, exclusivism, Christian nationalism, the idea that all humans are evil, they're vile, and we're the only destruction. These people have transformed the good news into so many forms of toxic mind viruses. You might refer to them as cults. You know, even some traditional Christian strands might be cults in that sense. And it's the latter that I'm pushing back on, the latter that I'm pushing back on, and Christian humanism is what I'm now promoting. So, Scott, I think we're going to move a bit more quickly here. The next question I asked him was, what were the benefits they saw in going down that slippery slope? The one where you ask questions, test ideas and tenets, and reject the ones that no longer seem to be justifiable. And here's what they said.
This is going to sound strange, but I think not having the joy of the Lord has made me have a lot more joy in life. I'm not as anxious about hell. I feel like I can embrace people for who they are. We always said love the sinner, hate the sin, but it never really was accurate. Like we talked about homosexuals and people in the LGBTQ community, like we just disparaged them all the time. And even like they could visit, but they couldn't be a member. And I just feel like I can see people, like just accept them. And I don't believe they're going to hell. And I don't think they're evil, you know, like I was raised to think that every human was born evil and separated from God, and that without God, they were just garbage, you know, and that's how I view myself. That's how I view everybody around me. And it's like, just like these pieces of garbage that needed the Creator to come and shine them up. And now I just see people as people with hearts and value. I see the intrinsic worth of everybody now more than ever. It just has made me a much happier person. Even people I've known for years have told me in the last couple of years, like, you seem really happy lately. And it's like, what happened? Well, I lost Jesus, you know, like this kind of, it's just like this weird.
Yeah, I mean, where I've landed is that the point of existence, if there is one, is for us to become strong-willed creatures who transcend conditioning, transcend getting shoved by this and that in life, and really allow our consciousness to guide us in following the truth. And only then do we become like real people.
Well, the main benefit is a sense of freedom, sense of belonging to the rest of, well, humankind, really, other religious communities. I'm comfortable around anyone who embraces the concept of kindness and love. Therefore, I can be comfortable around Buddhists and even around atheists. And that's the area that I am processing actually most actively recently.
Well, I think that there was always a gnawing discontent that I didn't really believe it. There were all along inconsistencies with that I just couldn't quite handle. So the good part is the loss of that discontent and feeling like I'm being true to myself.
Yeah, some of those statements are, a little shocking, right? Especially the one guy who talks about, I lost Jesus, and what he's saying there is he lost a particular form of understanding Jesus,
Right.
right?
Yeah.
And that particular ideology can be very oppressive. And
Yeah.
I have a good friend that I went to a seminary with him, and we were very, very close. And he eventually became an atheist after many years in ministry and so on. And he had a similar journey to what we've listened to from a lot of our listeners. And one thing that he has said to me many times is that he's never felt more free, more liberated.
Hmm.
And it's just really interesting to hear, because these are the kind of things that often you hear from Christians, right? That they have that same sense that they've been freed and so on. So I think when you're kind of trapped in an oppressive religion or ideology, and then you break free of it, that it's obviously a very liberating experience.
Right. I also love that first listener that we heard there. And when he began, he said, no longer having the joy of the Lord has made me a much happier person.
Yeah.
I had a big laugh. I edited that out, but I had a huge laugh at that. But I also thought it was really thought-provoking to hear three of them say that one of the outcomes of rejecting traditional Christian faith was that they could accept people better, more graciously and more openly and more fully. And at first that was ironic and humorous. I was kind of laughing at it, but as I began to chew on that, it really made me sad that traditional Christianity made them less loving, less tolerant, less gracious, and on the other hand, more judgmental, more divided, more othering. And I need to add, that is completely not the gospel message.
Yeah, I think it was Jonathan Swift who said that most people have enough religion to make them hate each other, but not enough to make them love each other, and I think there's just a lot of wisdom in that.
Right. I was also caught by that one listener in the middle of all that. He said that in going down the slippery slope, one becomes more fulfilled, and he said more real. And this is exactly the idea that I see captured by Plato in his allegory of the cave, which not only ends with the person becoming more fulfilled and complete, but also that person develops this urgency to go back into the cave and to open the eyes of the other people who are still trapped in that kind of thinking. I would highly recommend to all of our listeners to check out Plato's allegory of the cave. You can Google it. It's easy to find. It'll take you less than an hour to read, and I guarantee you'll come away from that a changed person. You'll be chewing on it for days. If you're an introspective kind of a person, you will chew on that for a while. And if you're like me, you might even start writing a blog and then a podcast out of it. So, not only do I see this comment from the listener about becoming more fulfilled and real after going down the slippery slope, not only do I see that playing out in the imagery of Plato's allegory of the cave, transforming individual people, I also see that comment that he made, we become more real and more fulfilled, in the imagery of humans climbing up again that metaphorical ladder and becoming more complex in all those ways, including morally, ethically, and religiously. So this journey down the slippery slope doesn't just change individual people for the better, a la Plato's cave, but also the whole human species, a la that whole evolutionary ladder in Christian humanism.
Yeah.
So there's one last question that I asked these five listeners, and this may come across as shameless self-promotion. And I won't deny that's part of what motivates me to share this, but I also share this because it says something important about the kind of listener base we want to divert our energy towards, or at least I do. A bit of a new direction for this podcast and a transformation to some extent. I asked them two questions back to back, which are overlapping and yet they're somewhat distinct. What I said was this: now that you've given up so much of Christianity, why are you still picking away at it, reading books and listening to podcasts, and why are you listening to our podcasts? And here's what they said.
I was just joking with one of my friends who made the similar journey at the similar time 30 years ago. There's just parts of it that are always going to be bothering you about, like, what was really happening in the Old Testament here, or what really happened with Paul there. What's he really talking about? And I view it kind of like an airplane that I loved flying in my youth, and then it crashed. And now I'm like really curious what the airplane was. And so I have this huge hangar deck and I try and reassemble parts. But for me, the baggage is gone. Like, I know that there's no reconstruction I could do that would make the plane fly again. But yeah, I mean, there's parts of it that I'm just always curious about. But it's in a more healthy place now. Now it's just genuine academic curiosity.
Well, because I still wish to hold on to some of the good. And also, I think I feel affirmed in listening to you guys, and also feel like it's very instructive, just the pure science. I'm a physician. I think that's part of where I fell off the fundamentalist slope a little bit. People that were so tied to a very fundamentalist view of things, once they begin to slip, and they talk about the slippery slope, well, it's true for them, because there's no way you can accept part of it. Once they reject a little of it, it's gone. And to me, that's the danger of fundamentalism, is that you can lose it all. And I don't want to lose it all. I would like to hold on to what seems valuable.
It fascinates me. Like I kind of become obsessed with it. I did, the typical route where you start with, Richard Rohr and Rob Bell, and then Brian McLaren, and who are kind of on the edge. And then you're like, okay, this works for a little bit. And then you're like, it still doesn't sit right. And then you go to, like the Four Horsemen, and now like Alex O'Connor and all the other ones that are popping up, I just find it really fascinating. And I loved your podcast, because you kind of dork out on it. You guys really dig into the details, which I just love it. And part of me still just wants to be able to get a full picture. Because like I said, I'm not resistant to Christianity. If it proves itself to be true, absolutely, I'll jump on board in a heartbeat. It's just I don't see it right now. And I think that just by listening to you guys and other channels and books and things, I can get a better understanding of am I wrong?
You're doing amazing work with this, and I still continue to be puzzled and amazed what actually drives you to do that, because I know you are not benefiting financially from this. So yeah, you are a big example to me.
Well, I will say I've listened to many podcasts that deal with Christianity, deconstruction, liberal Christianity, etc. And yours is the only one I've stuck with. It's the only one that's been truly worthwhile, that I don't end up pulling my hair out wanting to scream at the iPhone. Literally, you are the only podcast left on my iPhone that I listen to regularly, and I've listened to many of them. Well, Bart Ehrman I still listen to, but he's not a Christian. You just always come up with new fascinating things to listen to, and interesting guests. You guys have done a fantastic job. I hope you keep going, because purely selfish reasons.
Yeah. Well, that's very encouraging. It's nice to hear those kind of comments, especially, I'm sure, for you, Luke, because I know how much work you put into this.
It's a combined effort. This is very much a combined effort. We, there's that proverb, iron sharpens iron, and you certainly have sharpened my irons. So, but the point in all of that was that these are people who wrote in, and they're still scratching the itch. They don't want to just simply lampoon Christianity. They're still looking for the evidence, looking for the good stuff, trying to pan for gold, as a metaphor might go. And or scratching the itch. We've often used that phrase. We did an episode on that, episode number 41. They're still scratching the itch. And that's the target audience that we want to pour our energy into. So Here's the last thing I want to talk about in this episode. Where do we go from here? How do we proceed? First, this whole exercise, again, the 8-part series on Who is Jesus to Me Now, culminating with me, finally crystallizing my current theology, and then hearing feedback from our listeners, who we seem to be impacting the most. This exercise made me realize that this podcast needs to narrow its focus a bit more. I've been playing to some extent both sides, trying to mollify, to reassure the traditional Christians in my audience, while at the same time leaning in the direction of those who are quite critical of traditional Christianity, some even hostile to it and even rejecting Christianity outright. And that's a really hard tightrope to walk for a podcaster. We could easily attract a larger audience by fully affirming the Bible as God's Word, overplaying how we can still read it uncritically, how there really is no conflict between much of science and much of current Christian theology, and how God is clearly speaking to us through science and through the Bible and through whatever. There's lots of podcasts available out there like that. And equally, we could easily attract a larger audience by mocking crazy ideas that various groups of Christians believe. I've long enjoyed a podcast or YouTube channel that focuses almost exclusively on young earth creationism in general and Ken Ham in particular. And I've recently come across another podcast that's it seems to be getting quite a bit of attention, focusing on the most outlandish, scandalous Christian claims, things that are truly half-baked, embarrassing, and backwards. That one in particular I see just as religious schadenfreude. You know, the rubberneckers who crane their necks to see the carnage and suffering at a major car accident on the highway, or the tabloid magazines at the supermarket. And again, there's lots of podcasts out there that do that. But I have no interest in occupying either of those two ends of the spectrum. I don't think Scott does either.
No.
I want to focus on that middle space, that thin line, that tightrope that's willing to criticize theology or science that doesn't hold up to scrutiny, and yet willing to embrace theology and science that does work together. The space where people wrestle with the uncomfortable truths of Christianity and try to find something theologically meaningful and intellectually defensible, rather than privately, rejecting everything Christian and moving on, that euphemistic throwing the baby out with the bathwater. I want to provide a counter-narrative for those on the slippery slope, and I fully expect to get flack from the left and the right.
Well, I hope so, because that's when you know you're saying something worthwhile.
Right, yeah. Finally, I need to inform the listeners that there will be a bit of a cosmetic change or a logistical change for the podcast. In the past, when we're in season, I've tried to put out an episode every week, Friday morning. For many reasons, that's been getting harder to do. And we won't actually end the season, not end the podcast, but we will kick it down to a lower gear. There will be less regularity and less punctuality. A few weeks might go by between each episode, but each episode that does come out will still meet our high standards for a good quality episode. And we invite your comments. One of the listeners pointed out how we don't get any kind of remuneration for putting out this podcast. We don't want that. We're not monetized in any way. We don't have a grant from the Templeton Foundation. We don't get checks from churches or groups or individuals. The only payment we ask from you is that you tell a friend. Of course, like and subscribe, but then also send us an email and tell not just one friend, tell a few friends.
Well, we used to get checks for churches, and then Luke had to go last time and blab off about his newfound faith, and that cut that off pretty quick.
Oh, Scott, that's funny. With that, stay tuned and keep scratching.
Bye for now.
You've been listening to Recovering Evangelicals with your hosts, Luke Jansen and Scott Dyer. Send your comments and suggestions for new episodes to lukejjansen@gmail.com or scottedwarddyer@gmail.com, or leave them at our YouTube channel. Same name, same logo. Subscribe to lukejjansen.wordpress.com if you want to get advanced releases and group posts, or browse through our archive for a full listing of all our previous episodes. And please help the podcast by sharing with a friend and leaving a review at your favorite podcast catcher.